Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to the Housing and Webinar series. Today's topic and our last in the series is housing and inequality. My name is Piotr Borslawski, liaison agent for the housing dossier at the TQSOI, Tabakate du Sud-Ouest de Lille. Our webinars are being held within the context of our Housing for All project, with the first objective of facilitating and empowering the West Island community to share their knowledge of the current housing issues. This will stimulate brainstorming and enable residents and local stakeholders to co-create solutions for more diverse housing opportunities suitable for the West Island context. For more information, be sure to check out our website, housingforallwi.org. The link is in the chat. Now I'd like to invite Alex, Housing Dossier Coordinator at the TQSOI, to say a few words. Alex will be working backstage to make sure everything goes smoothly and will be moderating the chat and Q&A portion of the webinar.
Thanks, Piotr. So if this is your first webinar with us, things might look a little different on Zoom today. That's because we're using Zoom's webinar format, which means that you can only see and hear the panelists and our moderator, Piotr. So unlike a regular Zoom meeting, you are not able to see yourselves and the other attendees. This is normal. One of the main Zoom functions that you'll be using today as attendees is the chat, which you can access by clicking on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. In the chat, you can type up any questions you might have that come up during the webinar. Please note that if you'd like your questions to appear to all panelists and attendees, which we encourage, you'll have to select the all panelists and attendees in the drop-down menu that is in the chat. Also, feel free to ask your questions in French. When we do get to the Q&A period, I'll be reading the questions that are in the chat out loud. So feel free once again to put in your questions as we go. You don't have to wait till the end. During the Q&A period, you'll also have the option to virtually raise your hand by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. At that point, we can then let you ask your question out loud by yourself once we give you the chance to speak. We encourage you all to stay with us for the length of the webinar. After the panelists close their discussion, we'll have the Q&A period, but we'll also be leaving some minutes at the end for you to fill out a short evaluation form. And finally, please note that today's webinar is being recorded.
Thanks, Alex. Housing inequality is both a cause and an effect of income inequality itself. Disparities in housing are directly related to racial, social, and income inequality. But before we start, out of curiosity, what do you think the median yearly income is before taxes of an individual in the West Island? I'm going to launch a poll, see what people think. Give you 30 seconds to answer it. Well, you guys were all pretty close, but it's a variety, as you can see. It's actually 38,516. By government standards, that leaves approximately $962 each month for housing expenses per person in the West Island. Just driving from Centerville to Pierrefonds, you can see the income inequality. Median income varies greatly across the West Island, but 1/3 of the West Island population makes less than $20,000 per year. Social inequality is a factor of housing inequality when people are denied access to housing due to their social, economic, or race. Housing inequality also acts on a social inequality. Housing inequality also acts on social inequality, as the location of a home can determine access to basic services and amenities. Across the West Island, housing circumstances and location vary greatly. And how are these connected to inequality? We're going to talk about that today. But before we start, we'd like to introduce our panelists. For our first panelist, we have Helene from the West Island Women's Shelter. Helene has been there since 2009 and is now mother-child counselor for the shelter. Since 1979, the shelter has been and continues to be a safe place for both women and children's victims of conjugal violence. The shelter works to temporarily help and house battered women and their children in the West Island and establishes and maintains links with police, hospitals, social services, and community groups, and more to facilitate references in public education. We'd also like to welcome Kemba Mitchell from the West Island Black Community Association. Kemba is a proud third-generation African Canadian, a mother, a relentless activist for empowerment and advancement of Black Montreal. Kemba proudly serves as the chairperson of the West Island Black Community Association and a long-standing pillar of the community. WIBCA is a nonprofit community organization that was founded in 1982 to respond to the needs of the community. WIBCA stands today as a hub of community life with an extended slate of programs to enhance the lives of students, adults, and seniors in the area. The organization educates the public on health issues and multiculturalism. It also seeks to relieve loneliness and isolation associated with aging by providing recreational, educational, and cultural activities for senior citizens. WIBCA also operates a drop-in center for youth, providing counseling, education, and recreational activities. Last but not least, we have David Hawkins from the West Island LGBTQ2+ Center. David has been an executive director for the West Island LGBTQ+ Center since June 2018, after working as a coordinator for 2 years. David is in charge of the day-to-day operations of the center, whose mission is to have a place in which lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgendered, questioning, two-spirited, and people of other sexual orientations and genders and identities are welcomed with open arms. The center provides a safe place for individuals to explore their sexual and gender identities and to socialize and foster inclusiveness. The center offers educational programs and acts as a resource to the community regarding LGBTQ+ issues and advocates for the community regarding social and public policy. Founded in 2011, the center is the only resource in the West Island region for region of Montreal and has a variety of programs that cater different demographics within the community. Thank you all for joining us today and for taking the time to discuss housing and inequality. So let's dive right in. Let's open up with a very open question. What does housing inequality mean to you? David, I'd love for you to start.
So for me, housing inequality means a couple different things. First and foremost, I think that we often tend to think of it as kind of an isolated problem, but housing inequality in reality is just kind of one node in a much larger web of systemic inequalities. As a community, we, the queer community, have a very long history with not being able to find accommodations. We have a long history of experiencing discriminations of different kinds, homophobia, transphobia from landlords who don't want undesirables living in their houses or within their units. As a community, we are far more likely to experience income inequality, be financially insecure or employment insecure. And so factors like that end up aggravating the already existing problems of housing inequality. When we talk about the LGBTQ community, I just want to actually start off by maybe giving a really brief definition of what that means. I understand that some of our viewers may not have a really well ingrained knowledge of what it means to be part of the queer community. So just off the bat, I wanted to take a quick moment and say that when we talk about the LGBTQ2+ community, we're really talking about a wide community of different sexualities and gender identities. Using an abbreviation like LGBTQ, LGBTQ2, LGBTQIA, these are all different kind of acronyms that different organizations and different people use that resonates more closely with them. But really, it's just a shorthand version of a much longer acronym that has something like 28 or 29 letters and characters. And so each one of those characters stands in for a different sexuality or a different gender identity. So my organization, we call ourselves West Island LGBTQ2+ Center, and that really just means lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, or transgender, depending on which definition you're more comfortable with, the term queer, and then two-spirit to acknowledge our Indigenous communities in North America. But that's not to say that that's one right way of saying it. There are a dozen different ways that people can refer to it.
Interesting. Kemba, what does housing inequality mean to you?
Well, for me, I just want to first define what it is. So by definition, housing inequality is a form of economic disparity and can be directly linked to systemic racism and social imbalance. So with that said, and using the West Island as an example, it is clear when we look at visible minorities and where they are disproportionately settled. So if you look at the West Island, you will notice that there are predominantly visible minorities in Pierrefonds and in Dollar des Ormeaux, as opposed to Bazaar and Point Claire and Beaconsfield, where you'll see more, well, I would say non-visible minorities. So I see it in two parts. There are people who are home owners, so home ownership, as well as home rental. So in terms of home ownership, I wanted to speak about this concept of redlining. So redlining is basically when banks outright or deny mortgages to people based on the group of characteristics like race, for instance. And so this concept derived from the US. So it's during the Great Depression. And it was a system of policies to make sure that they stabilize the economy. So allowing poor people to be able to purchase homes in suburbs. So, so basically the green areas were populated with white businessmen and their families. And the red areas were for foreign-born and Black people. So i.e. redlining. People applying for loans in the red areas on the map were considered too high risk and for lending and were denied mortgages. So although the concept of redlining is very American, the same type of concept has happened in Canada. And particularly, I would have to say in Nova Scotia. There's many, if you look it up, there's many, there's much information based on that concept of redlining. And Canada, as I said, has too been guilty of similar practices. And they directly contribute to the widening of the generational wealth gap with Black families in comparison to our white counterparts. Families who own their own homes are able to pass down equity, while children of families that don't can only expect inherent rising costs. So again, if you have a family that purchased property in the 40s and 50s, naturally, you know, you build your equity, and this is very helpful for families. But if you've never had that opportunity, now you want to purchase the property, let's say in Beaconsfield, let's say you can't afford it. It's highly unlikely you're going to be able to afford it. And if I move on to home rental, well, there are two racial disparities amongst renters. Black families and individuals are more likely to be denied access to rental property simply due to stereotypes. People assume, oh, they have huge families, they're criminals, they're drug users. And so it puts Black families and individuals in a very uneasy situation just to be able to afford or just to be able to live in places that they wish to.
Very good point. You hit it on the nail right there, because you can see it. You can really see it in the West Island, right? The dividing line of the 40 and the different densities and minorities in areas. You can really see that. Helen, for you, in your experience at the shelter, what does housing inequality mean to you? Helen, your mic. It's okay. Yeah, it's off.
Sorry.
It's okay.
So one of the biggest challenges that our families faced is the obstacle of when a woman and a family is leaving an abusive partner is, where will we live? Where are we going to go? And this will often impact their decision to leave an abusive relationship. And it could be actually a case of life or death, right? Mm. So a lot of our women are victims of economic violence, and their partner through the violence has created a sense of financial dependency or uncertainty, which basically leads her to believe that she will not be able to answer to the needs for her and her kids. I have a case recently, actually, where a young woman was pregnant, and her husband had such control over the finances that he would go and work out of province for the week, come back on the weekend, and he would meter out the food that she would have during the week that he was away. And she was a newly immigrant. She had no support, so she was stuck in an apartment, pregnant, with no furniture and no food. And I have another case of a woman who was working. However, all of the money went into the family account, and he used all of the money for his own activities, and there was actually no food left in the fridge for the kids during the week. So all to say that this economic violence, where he is also able to create all sorts of debts in her name and not pay rent, and she's left holding the bag, means that she just doesn't have the finances. She doesn't have, and a lot of her women, some have work, but others are on welfare. And realistically, the money is just not there, right? So the women, all that they want to do is they want to seek a place that is safe and affordable. And those are really important for them, the safety aspect and the affordable aspect, when she leaves an abusive relationship. So now applying for housing with poor credit, no credit, is very difficult. And now in times of COVID, it's even more impacted, right? So if we take, for example, we talked about Beaconsfield and all that. So the median range, based on the CHMC report of October 2019 for the boroughs of Pointe Claire, Dollard, and Pierrefonds, I believe, averaged out is $1,000 a month, right? So that doesn't include heating, electricity, internet, and as you said, most of the families are below the 20,000 range. Okay, so that means most of their money goes to rent. What happens to the basics? Food, clothing, transportation. We're not even talking luxuries here. We're talking basic, talk about Maslow's pyramid. We're talking very basic. So for us, inequality means that our families are faced with staying in an abusive relationship or being able to provide a safe haven for her kids in an area where they choose to live.
Yeah. Kemba, Helen mentioned COVID. How has the impact of COVID-19 disproportionately affected people of color, and it's definitely in certain areas of the West Island?
I would have to say it definitely has. There's a huge impact that is perhaps very different from many others. I would have to say discrimination. So there is proof that when discriminated against, being discriminated against, these instances do lead to chronic and toxic stress. And this is directly related to, placing people in situations where they have an increased risk of contracting COVID-19. If you talk about healthcare, there is an underlying distrust with healthcare, the doctors, and this is through history. Do you trust what your doctor is saying? Do they have your best interests at heart? So unfortunately, many people of color, I would say Black people, are the frontline workers. They're the ones who, work in the hospitals. They're the ones who are work in the grocery stores. They're perhaps the people who ride the bus drivers. So, and a lot of times in their households, living in a household with a multi-generational household is the norm. And so having, let's say, to be in the position of the frontline workers, the risk increases of contracting COVID. And if you do contract COVID, they're not necessarily in the position to be able to self-isolate. If you have a home with 3 generations, you maybe have 1 bathroom. How are you supposed to self-isolate? Some of these positions do not allow you to work from home. So, if you have this maybe comfortable corporate job and, oh, there's COVID, you know what, you're going to be able to work from home now. Not everyone is in that position to do so. Some people fear even saying they're sick because they can't afford to take the time off. If your child is in school and let's say their bubble someone has COVID, hey, you have to go home now. You have to now work, link to school from home. Not everyone's in a position to take the time off to be home with their child. So apart from that, I would have to say that, so that's the occupation. The occupation is a risk. it impacts us differently because proven that Black people and people of color are more than likely receive a lower income salary, right? So, you know, purchasing masks and gloves and all of these things that are there to protect us, we're not necessarily able to do that. So I spoke with housing, occupation, and just even the language. There's a lot of people here that, you know, English and French may not even be their mother tongue. And so a lot of the information, particularly in Quebec, I've personally received information from Montreal that's all in French. And this is all in French, but for information about health. So could you imagine if you're in this country and your mother tongue is not English or French, how are you supposed to get the information? You know, where is the testing centers? You know, what am I supposed to do in my household? And one of the major issues is that there is no race-based data collection. So when the Black community is rising and saying, listen, this is disproportionate, this is unfair, there's no data to back it up. And I know there's independent organizations that are working very hard to push the government to start to collect the data that is needed. So we can say here, this is what I mean when we are disproportionate. We're at a higher risk of contracting this virus or whatnot because of these factors. So when the government does support the important part of collecting this data, we'll be in a better situation.
You're definitely right. The aspect of data, for example, I was looking at unemployment. Unemployment has skyrocketed during during COVID. We're up to, it was at 1.14%, but it was disproportionate in the sense who was unemployed. The government still doesn't know who's gig workers, hourly wage workers, like you mentioned. These are people that need the hourly wages, can't get sick in the sense because they need that money, right?
Maybe no sick days, no personal days. You don't have that luxury. And this is a direct impact to some of the people in the Black community.
David, Kemba mentioned support. Does your community do they have that support for each other, or are they all left alone as well?
So, I mean, for centuries, the queer community has always had to rally around themselves for support. That's not something that's new. I mean, for centuries and for decades, society has made it very clear that they don't want us. They want nothing to do with us. We are seen as being undesirable components of community. There's still very active fights about that. And so oftentimes it has come down to members of the community to support themselves. I mean, that's the whole reason that gay villages exist. That's the whole reason that queer neighborhoods are a thing across the world, is because as a community we need to come together to support ourselves, because we don't get that support from society as a whole necessarily. COVID has been a really interesting struggle for a lot of us, because a lot of those community structures and community supports that we've spent decades and centuries fostering are no longer accessible to us. We cannot go to a friend's house where that friend has made it actively clear that their home is a space where you can come and be openly yourself. A lot of queer community organizations within and around Montreal have noticed that doing their programs online are not necessarily going to work. We ourselves noticed it. At our youth drop-in, we were averaging 15 to 20 kids a night, Wednesdays and Fridays prior to COVID. And then when we had to move our programs online, we were only getting 1 or 2 people coming to our programs online. And that's for a variety of reasons. Not having access to secure internet connections or having access to the technology is one thing. But something that a lot of people made abundantly clear was that they were not comfortable accessing this support system online where their parents might overhear, or where they are going to talk about the experiences of being queer at home with family that's not supportive and risk getting that backlash from their family. one of the things that I found really interesting was in our parents support group, we were averaging 8 to 10 people a month at that program that meets once a month. And once COVID hit, we went down to an online attendance of between 0 and 1 people a month. And the parents, same thing, they were saying that they were trying to be supportive and they were trying to put on a brave face for their kid who is queer or gay or trans or what have you, but that they couldn't necessarily talk about the struggles that they were having or the fears or the concerns that they were experiencing when their kid might overhear them from the next room. And so for us, COVID also hit us really hard as a community because a lot of those conventional support networks that we have spent so long fostering are no longer accessible to us.
You mentioned that some of your community hasn't been able to call in or go online because of the fear of their family. Have you heard of stories where they've been kicked out and like that ultimate fear of being left alone?
I mean, in our community, that's a tale as old as time.
Oh.
That's not new. It's not old. It's always been there. I mean, over the years, I've met a lot of people who don't have relationships with their family anymore. Those conventional support networks that each one of us as people should have access to, our family, they don't have those supports because they aren't talking with their parents. They're not talking with their siblings. Their extended family don't want anything to do with them because they've come out as gay or trans or they're living openly as such. I know of a lot of people who are living in family environments and they can't afford to leave, again, because housing nowadays is so unaffordable. And so they're stuck living in this really toxic environment because their parents are not supportive of them, say in their trans identity, as an example. They, as a person, may be presenting as very female. They may be have a female name and female pronouns, but their parents or their siblings will not get over the fact that when that person was born that they were assigned male and given a different name and different pronouns, and so they're still adhering to that old idea of the person, and that automatically creates a space that's not welcoming and not safe. But especially now in COVID, there's nowhere else we can go. I mean, I know of a lot of people, same thing with their employment as well. The moment that they come out openly as gay or trans or queer, or even if they're perceived as such, not even if they come out, suddenly they face a lot of backlash. They get ostracized from their work community. They, in some instances, go so far as to lose their jobs, or they kind of get forced out, and while they're not being fired, they kind of have to make the decision to leave because it's no longer a safe environment. And so over the years, I've met people who cross this whole spectrum. I'm very lucky in that I had a wonderful coming out experience. I didn't lose anybody in my life, nobody that mattered really. Like I've still got a great experience with my parents, my siblings, my aunts, my uncles, everything. But I am the exception to that. I am not the standard. I am the exception.
I had no idea that coming out is such it's a fear and a risk of even like losing your shelter essentially as well. Have you seen cases of homelessness like where they've been driven to the brim?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have heard and that's not to say it doesn't happen, but I have heard less people saying my parents have thrown me out of the house or my roommates have thrown me out. I've heard less of that and more, I know I had nowhere else to go, but I personally needed to leave because I couldn't keep living in that environment. It was not good for me mentally. It was not good for me physically. And so I had to elect to leave knowing that I have nowhere else to go.
Mm.
And something I think that we don't necessarily talk about in the West Island is that even though there are a lot of really active community organizations that really work to take care of the community, we can't do everything. We're not everywhere. And I think in a lot of minority groups, that gets felt especially hard. I mean, if we look at the standard case of trans people, they don't feel welcome in a lot of shelters. If we're looking at a trans woman who's homeless, a lot of shelters may not be willing to accommodate a trans woman because by their policy or by their personal opinions, they don't see that trans person as being woman enough.
Mm.
And so a shelter that is supposed to help everyone isn't in this case. Or homeless shelters that are co-ed, not co-ed, are unisex.
Mm.
They're designed that way so that there's not necessarily that sexual aspect to it. And once you introduce a gay person or a queer person to the mix, suddenly now that sexual component becomes a concern, even though it shouldn't be a concern. I mean, I don't know anybody who has been homeless and who has said, "Oh, I want to go to a shelter to have sex." That doesn't happen. But that ends up being the interpretation that a lot of people take when they're approaching the queer community.
Helen, David mentions that his community center is just the tip of the iceberg. Do you believe that's true in your case as well, that there's a lot more cases of women being struggling to leave?
Yeah, I mean, statistically, I mean, there's only 20% of the population will actually end up leaving an abusive relationship. And during the time of COVID, it was very difficult because women, everybody was confined. So the women didn't have an opportunity to necessarily go to the grocery store or to go and make a call to get help through either SOS or, they weren't meeting social workers at the CLSC. They just didn't have that opportunity. And the kids weren't in school. So any kind of flags that would be happening to the kids in schools, that wasn't there either. So during our confinement, we were very, very concerned because the calls weren't coming in, women were not leaving. We were concerned of all the repercussions that would be happening to the families. And after the deconfinement started to open up and whatever, obviously calls were coming in and people were going. And now we're hearing from the women that during the confinement, everything was exacerbated. Everything was so much more difficult, and kids and the partner being at home and trying to work and trying to make things work and feeling of despair with no way out. Like they just had no way out. So yeah, it's been very difficult that way.
Have you been able to find them rentals in the area, or do they want to even leave the West Island because of that safety issue? What are you seeing?
Most of the women, well, what we ended up doing a number of years ago, we ended up to answer two needs. One, the safety need, and also the need of low income, is we built a second stage house. So, but that only answers a very, very small part of the population. And, when we talk safety, we're talking very specifically if the woman is in actual serious danger. So that was one of our criteria. So it doesn't always happen that it has to be to that extent. So the women are forced to leave the West Island. They're actually forced to choose to have to move out of the area that they know, that the kids know.
Interesting. Kemba, I'm curious though, because Helen's mentioning aspects of life diminishing when it comes to housing. Have you seen that Have you seen that in your community? That the diminishing of aspects of everydayness, and then when housing every month, every year, when you talk to their landlords, the rent goes up. Does that become even worse and worse?
Well, recently we've been, there's been a community of a specific community that a lot of the statuses of the individuals, they have a refugee status. So they were talking about the, as soon as, because this status, once you supply your social insurance number, that there's a number that kind of, they know that is your, and so there's been a lot of discrimination with that. And so these families come and they have children, and right away they're telling us they know. And sometimes coming to Canada, it's the first time they know, they understand what racism is. And they're saying They don't even get a chance. Sometimes you don't even get a chance in the door just simply with your name. And then if you do get in there, and then they start asking questions like, do you have children? I never knew that was a question that you're supposed to ask as a landlord. Do you have children? How many children? You know, and then there's an assumption that everyone, like, they're unemployed, they don't work. And so there's so much discrimination across the board. And it's just, I mean, I pulled some numbers from the 2016 census, and they said, like, there's 9.4 million Canadians living in housing below standards. And then when I pulled the number for Black Canadians, it's 2.6% of Black Canadians reported living in housing below their standards, which means their housing costs more than they can afford, and or crowded, and or requires major repairs, while only 7.7% of white Canadians reported living in housing below standards. So right there, that's the data Canada-wide, telling us the difference in terms of the life of an individual that is renting. And, you know, there's effects known to the children. You know, if you live in a condition that is not, it's not up to standard, how does that impact children? How does that impact, you know, when they go to school? Like, there's just so many, there's such a ripple effect of the impact. So it's really, what do we do? You know what I mean? What do we do from now? What can be done to support, in this case, you know, people from the LBGP, gotta help me out, David. You know, women and people of visible minorities. What do we do to make sure that everyone is on the same level playing field?
In your experience, have you seen visible minorities and refugees not know their rights as tenants?
Yes, yes. And this is where community organizations like ours come into place, and to be advocates, and to you know, to host information sessions so that people are equipped to know their rights. And then even if you have to tag along with the individual and say, listen, you are not allowed to ask these questions. We will report you to, I think it's called the Bureau Rental Board or whatever. Like, people have rights. There's people that abuse their positions. And I think that community organizations like ours, our responsibility is really to be there and to protect and advocate for the community. So with that, there's a lot to learn. I know for us at WIBCA, we're relearning about, you know, making sure that we have the right connections in the governments, to make sure that we have the right information to share, and continue to advocate for all people.
I'm curious, out of raising your hands, how many of your clients for all of you, have recently been evicted or have had to fight an eviction in the past recently? No, right? Not yet. Okay. I am curious if the refugees do not know their rights as tenants, are they more likely to get evicted? Has anyone seen that before? Like, I've seen it in the news, but I'm curious if in the West Island there's been push because these landlords are wanting to renovate. Right now, there's a time of sitting at home and no one's doing anything. It's a perfect time to renovate. And I'm curious if these renovictions have been coming up in the West Island in these communities as well. That's very interesting to see. There's a ripple effect. We'll see how that comes along, because it could happen next year, in the next cycle of renting. Okay, so I need solutions now, because this is really, I'm getting really depressed, and I need some light at the end of the tunnel. Helen, how can affordable housing help provide opportunities to balance your inequalities that you've seen?
Listen, the fact that we, like, our women and our families don't have affordable housing, you know, it affects everything. It affects everything in their life, right? It affects where the kids are going to go to school. I mean, the women struggle. I have a woman that I'm working with right now who struggled so much with just the idea of changing her kid's school. The fact that she wants to create a stability, the fact that she wants to give them an area where it's safe for them to live, obviously. They're faced with uprooting their kids when they leave an abusive partner. Sometimes they arrive at our house with nothing but the clothes on their back. And sometimes just a few pieces of important papers that they were able to grab as they left, right? The kids have left their friends. They can't have friends over at the house. Everything is confidential. So the women also have lost their support system and all this. So it has a huge impact on all aspects, of their life. So, and then women who have finally left, they live a lot of post-separation violence. So partners will not pay for child support. They will avoid sharing assets, even though there's a court decisions. They'll use the courts to avoid paying or selling the house. I had a case where he decided that no, she wasn't going to get the house. So he literally flooded the house, didn't pay the mortgage. So it was worth absolutely nothing, right? So all of this, and in the meantime, where does she go? She has no place to go. She has no place in an area that she knows, that she's comfortable, that the kids are comfortable, that the activities that they have known possibly all of their life, the support, the friends and all that, they don't have that option to stay on the West Island. So they're forced to leave. They're forced to go into an area which creates a sense of isolation. And one of the big consequences of conjugal violence is that isolation. So it's like they're re-victimized once again, right? Yeah. So options, one of the things, like I had mentioned, we had a second stage house. That was one of our options to do. And we're looking at doing that because our second stage house is really for families. But we also have women that come and have no kids and they have nowhere to go either, right? So all the low-income housing on the West Island is all tagged for senior residences, for seniors. There's nothing for families, You look at the map for the HLMs, everything is tagged for seniors. So what happens to our families? I think options, I think one of the options, and I don't know if it's actually even doable, but is to develop partnerships with current landlords and see if they can actually be part of the low-income housing of the HLM bank of places to live. I think that, there's a lot of apartments on the West Island. Granted, some of them are not. I've heard horror stories as well. But to develop that kind of a partnership where there is that option without necessarily having to build brand new properties, right? Because, but to create that kind of partnership with existing landlords, would that be feasible? And then there's a whole stereotype that is attached to that could cause a problem as well. So
yeah, definitely tapping into a rental market is definitely something important because vacancy rates are ridiculously low right now.
Yeah.
In some areas, in like St. Anne and Bellevue, it's 0.4% vacancy rates. So definitely, it's a great idea mentioning the rentals because that's something very like we can tap into. David, how can affordable housing help your community?
So I think. Oh, hold on. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
Cool. Got it. I wasn't getting the little lit up box, so I thought maybe I wasn't coming through. I think that affordable housing can do a lot. I have a background in environment, and a lot of the way that I look at this is by providing somebody with affordable housing, you are increasing their resilience and their adaptability to external stressors. In short, you're making them less vulnerable. And as a community that is already highly vulnerable, I think that's especially holds true for the queer community. I think that it doesn't address all of the systemic problems that we still have in society. Having affordable housing does not address the fact that wages are stagnant and the purchasing power of a dollar is drastically lower now than it was 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. It doesn't address those underlying factors. But what it does do is it allows people to be a little bit safer and a little bit secure. Having affordable housing allows them a little bit more of that funding to be able to meet their other essential needs. When we talk specifically about the queer community, it actually does a whole lot of good for people within that community to be able to afford housing. It allows them to also look after their peers who are queer. It allows them to create safe spaces, inclusive, welcoming spaces for people who may not have a place to go otherwise, for people who may not be able to keep living at home. The number of friends I have had personally who have had to move in with friends in houses that they couldn't technically fit that many people, but they had nowhere else to go and they needed to leave. So to be able to have affordable housing allows people to actually take that liberty to move if they need to. If they're in a safe space, they should be able to go somewhere else. If we're talking about solutions, I think that one of the important things is expanding the idea of what it means to be discriminatory, homophobic, transphobic, racist, sorry, because oftentimes landlords can get away with awful things, but because they do not say something that is overtly homophobic or transphobic or racist or Islamophobic or misogynistic, they get away with it. I mean, I moved out for a short time to the East End, and I moved in with a friend of mine who was a girl, and both of us are part of the queer community, and we had to play straight for the landlord because we didn't know how we would be received. And so if a landlord says, oh, well, I've got this opening available, and then you go see the apartment and they're like, oh no, we don't have any openings, because they see that you're gay or because you're Black or because you're a single woman or anything like that, we have no fighting power against something like that. If they were to say, oh, I don't want a transsexual living in my apartments, then maybe you have a case, but then you also have to prove that they said it.
Yeah.
So expanding the protections that are available for minority communities and expanding the definition of these different kind of discriminations to include the nuanced, I think would be a huge step in working towards tenant rights.
That's a good point. Thank you. Kemba, David mentioned, obviously, we're not going to solve systematic issues today, obviously, but what can affordable housing help in your communities?
Well, I think both Helen and David touched on it. I mean, it's access to schools and, supporting, starting generational wealth, having a sense of pride. How great is it to own your own home or to rent a beautiful apartment? Let's diversify our cities and boroughs, and not just have people staggered in different areas. In apartments, there's these apartments, but why can't there be funding to build houses, affordable houses, to allow our families, whether single parent families, same-sex families, why can't they have a home with a backyard? There's land, again, having comfortable settings, to me, it should be the norm. It should not be dependent on what you look like, your sexual preference, your gender. It should be the norm. And so when we talk about solutions, I think about policing landlords, policing lenders, who's monitoring them, who's making sure that they're making the right call. I am a single mother, and I remember when I decided to, I got pregnant at a very young age, and I decided I'm leaving home and I'm going to go get that apartment. And I was discriminated. I didn't even realize I was being discriminated at the time, but they look at you, you're young. Well, how could you afford this? And there was many, and I filled out of 20 applications, perhaps maybe 3 only came back to me. And then by that time, maybe only 1 offered me an opportunity to rent. So I've been there. I know a lot of people that have faced similar situations. And so, but I also call upon our all levels of government to get engaged. We need to address the imbalance. and place policies and practices in place and work together to strengthen the affordable housing sector. Like we need to do this. And so I think that if we start to add this as a priority, hold people accountable, and again, like policing landlords, policing lenders, I think this will impact the injustices greatly. And again, the lack of discrimination data in Canada. We need to have this in place so that we can call people out and people are going to be held accountable. If not, it will continue because landlords will find creative ways to make sure that you don't get in their buildings. And so we have a responsibility to make sure that everyone has that chance to be comfortable in their environment.
And to create a sense of belonging, right? That's all that we want, right? Is to feel that we belong to our area, that we're safe in the area that we choose to be in.
And we can live in that area too.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yes.
I'm great. I'm going to leave it at that because that was exactly how I wanted to finish this discussion, because you're right. Community is now the new luxury. I think inclusive in communities is now, it should be the standard. So thank you.
It should not be a luxury. It should be the basic.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much for this great discussion. Okay, so now we've reached the Q&A portion of the webinar. So let's see what kind of questions the attendees have asked us for today. Alex, what do you got?
So we have a couple of comments and questions in the chat. So I just want to remind everyone to type any questions that they might have in the chat once again, and you can do so by clicking the chat button that appears at the bottom of your screen. I'll be reading some of them out loud. Remember that you also have the option to click the raise hand button, and we can then let you ask your question out loud yourself if you so desire. So we'll start from the beginning of the chat. We have a comment here. Many landlords refuse people with children because of complaints from neighbors and the wear and tear from apartments. Low-income families as well now need co-signers and are refused because of no credit or bad credit.
Everyone's nodding. Has everyone seen that before? Yeah. You're right. Credit has now become a sort of ranking system, hasn't it, for renters?
I'm a little bit because so I bought property many years ago, and I'm hearing that to rent property, it's like the same process. You got to give them everything to just rent property. I mean, when did this happen? Because I'm just confused. I mean, you have to give your banking information even before you get the apartment. Your social insurance, where you work. I mean, they do a credit background check. I mean,
I've been around for years. They've been doing that for years. That when you will go and apply, they will do a credit check on you. The problem is for example, in the case of our women, a lot of their credit is really bad, right? Through no fault of their own, right? So how do you get around it? And I know I saw in one of the feeds that they're asking for co-signers and all this, and but however, in our case of our situation, a lot of our women don't have the luxury of having a co-signer. They don't have somebody who could come in and say, yes, I will help. So then what happens? Exactly. David, have you seen that? You're nodding a lot.
Yeah, I mean, especially in the West Island, I think it's safe to say I'm of a different generation from Helene and from Kemba. And I'm just kind of now starting to look at the housing market, and a lot of people in my age bracket aren't able to get into the housing market. And a lot of people who I know who are 27, 28 years old, like myself, are still living with their parents because there are so many barriers to getting into the rental or housing market that need to be overcome. And people, at least in my generation, are not there yet. Entry-level jobs now, where your first career job or your minimum wage job that you do while you go to school, don't give you the luxury of being able to go out and pay the $1,300 that you need for an apartment in Pierrefonds nowadays. I mean, if I live in Pointe Claire, and there are a lot of new condos going up, there are a lot of new townhouses going up, there are a lot of new apartment buildings going up. I can't afford any of those. and I'm making a salary of almost $45,000 a year. And so all of these things are true, and they all pose additional barriers to what's already out there.
Yeah, you're right. I recently read that 1 in 3 millennial men are at home. 1 in 3. And that, yeah, that white picket fence has now become higher and higher, and we can't simply jump over it. Right. All right, Alex, anything else? What do we got?
We have another question. What consequences are there when communities isolate themselves from others through housing?
That's a good one.
I think the key consequence is it makes it harder for us to create inclusive communities or diverse communities. And I think I looked at this question, and I've been watching them school pass, and I was like, are there good consequences? And the reality is no. I don't think there are good consequences. There's a version of elitism that shows up more and more. And I think by default, all of the consequences I can think of are not positive.
I would agree with that. I think feeling a sense of belonging in your community is great, but when you stick within your community, that limits your opportunity to see other things and to engage with other communities. And I see that as an issue and concern. And when I think about our children, actually, so if you go to school in your community, you go to your house of worship or prayer in your community, you eat in your community, that's great. But Canada is
Diverse.
especially Montreal. I mean, we're multicultural, and what greater opportunity to learn from other communities and other cultures. So yeah, I see the concept of like the ghetto as one of those things where you build these apartments. I'll use an area in Pierrefonds, Cloverdale or Ama Bay, some people call it. So you have just a group of visible minorities in this area, and they do everything in this area. Maybe the only way that they come out is maybe when they go to work, right? But there's a disadvantage there. So I have to agree with David.
If sorry.
Go ahead.
If I can add on to that, and I just know that this is something coming up in the chat as well. Talking about my personal search for an apartment, the only stuff in the West Island I can afford is in Pierrefonds, in the region that we have now seen flood twice in the past 3 years, or twice in the past 4 years. Those are the only places that I can afford. And so as a renter, kind of good luck getting insurance with that. So it's that's coming up, and I'm sure we'll talk about that again in a moment.
Thanks, David, for keeping an eye on the chat.
Sorry.
So, no, it's great because there's an ongoing discussion, and it's wonderful. So we have another comment here that kind of goes back to what you said, David, about expanding the definition of discrimination and protections. I have helped over 30 asylum-seeking families arriving in the West Island over the past 3 years. And while I haven't heard of any being evicted, I do know that they are afraid to complain about substandard living space or the presence of infestations or insects. They are so afraid to lose the apartment.
That's scary.
Yeah. We have another comment here. For me, this is a very personal issue that touches me deeply. I was a single mom with 3 children and no family here in Canada. I had been a stay-at-home mom, then divorced. While I'm a woman who's Caucasian, so did not have to live the inequalities of people of color, I did live being ostracized by the friends I had as I was the first person to have divorced. They did not know how to handle it. I am talking about 38 years ago. Trying to find any type of housing for myself and my children and still stay close to their schools and friends was very difficult. Rents were high, but I decided to stay in Pointe Claire, so all of my income went into rent and food with nothing left for other items. I was discriminated against as I was a single woman with children and did not get apartments due to this. While I could not prove this, I do not know that I was not chosen, so I was not always able to provide the type of apartment that I needed for them. Fortunately, I was able to fight this over the years, and eventually I am now okay. But once again, it seems to be really going back to that discrimination practices that we see from landlords and the lack of resources that people have to fight against them.
Yeah, that small pool of rentals if and on top of the inequalities
Mhm.
that people are dealing with, it becomes even less. It's really, yeah, really hits.
We have another question here. What can we do about housing inequality and gentrification?
Oh, good question. We have the REM coming up. I don't know if you guys heard in the news, something called the REM going across the West Island. Do you think this will make it better or worse?
Worse.
Worse?
I
How do you see
mean,
that?
if I can use another personal example,
Go ahead. Yeah.
I live in my parents' house right on the other side of Fairview. Kind of, you know, those big condos that they're putting up now? Not those ones, the ones behind that.
Mhm.
And when my parents bought this house 10 to 12 years ago, I think they paid 245,000. Now the houses in that neighborhood are selling for $500,000. And that's just with the prospect of the REM coming up.
Yeah.
Once the REM is in, I'm expecting some of these small townhouses will probably sell for 600,000. And so, like, again, as someone who's looking to enter the housing market, how do I fit into that? As someone who's earning an entry level salary, there's no way I could ever afford a house with that. Even if I pooled money with 3 friends who work similar jobs, we wouldn't be able to afford that.
Kemba, you mentioned a lot of aspects of essential workers, right? The being hit hardest during COVID. Do you think they'll need the REM to get to work and to have that access to what's something we consider as essential now, like public transportation?
Well, stats show that, I mean, transportation is a concern. So when people are looking for jobs, they tend to obviously the preference is to work close to home. If you do not have a car, then the options, I mean, your time and commute plays a big part, especially if you have to run and get the kids or whatever, it plays a big part. So I think that it may offer some, actually, how much is it going to cost?
I was just going to say,
because I don't know,
to this.
because the train is more, right? So it depends on how much it's going to cost, because not everyone can afford it. I don't know. Let's hope that it's really convenient for people, because David, you spoke about your salary, but you're not within the norm. You're above, just to let you know,
Exactly.
based on the stats. Yeah, it depends on how much it costs. It could be convenient, yes, but I don't know. We'll have to see. We'll have to see. Again, transportation is a big factor in all of this. I know for even if you do have a vehicle, right? The wear and tear, the gas, it's like a ripple effect, you know. So I hope that the government took in consideration when they're building this massive communal thing, that the cost, that the cost is something that people who really need it could afford.
Okay, we have another comment. This is the one that David was referencing earlier. A lot of landlords are also renting out apartments that have not been repaired from our last flood, leaving the tenants to suffer with mold issues, not knowing what to do. Tenants are then referred to open up a file at the régie, which comes with a cost, and then have to wait at least 3-4 years to be heard in court. With all of these added expenses, how is it possible for anyone on welfare to afford this?
Have you guys seen that aspects like going to the régie to fight landlords is already an impossible feat in itself?
Just the fact of having to apply at the régie, where you have to go, there's a whole process before you apply at the régie, right? You have to send your letters, you have to send your mise en demeure, you have to do all this. So you have to basically build your file. People don't have the wherewithal, the energy to have to do that and to take the pictures and to do whatever they need to do, even to build their file. And then once they get to the rental board, and then they do apply, and it costs money. Like, it's based, if I remember correctly, I think it's based on the amount of rent that you pay. So you could actually have to, if you're paying $1,000, I don't know what the fees are, but it's quite expensive to even just to apply. So a lot of them, they won't even do that. And it causes other problems too, because there's the fear related to having to go to the rental board, and they have to prove their case, and it causes a feeling of angst.
Maybe there's an aspect where if you get arrested, you're legally given a lawyer, right? But in the case of losing your house or losing a roof over your head, there is no right to a lawyer to protect you from becoming homeless in that sense.
And I would say that I've heard of some of the landlords utilizing, there's like a loophole when you can get tenants out. So you can say that it's a family that needs to get in the space. So I've heard this being used many times. And how do you prove it not being true? So again, I think it's about policing landlords, and it's not to say, I mean, being a landlord is a great thing. I know people that are landlords. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying there has to be some way that we monitor what's going on, because there's a lot of injustices happening.
You mentioned that you have to go to the city of Montreal for these injustices. Are there, in the demerged cities, is there a place you can go? Like, do other cities have? No, right? I'm just curious. Yeah, me neither. I'm not. Have to look. We'll look into that, because yeah, the city of Montreal does have a housing bureau where they go and have inspectors take photographs. But I'm curious if that's also for the cross.
I think that's related to each borough. I think if you have a problem in your specific apartment or whatever you call the city that you live in, and they will possibly send inspectors in.
Yeah.
What needs to be done.
Okay.
I think the issue is that municipalities don't all have codes, though. That's what's missing, is that it's not something that's standardized. Yeah.
And I think to also, just to bring it back to making a complaint with the régie, as a society, we are very much well aware, once we start looking into it, how oftentimes we can bring what looks like an incredibly viable complaint to the régie and still getting it thrown back at us, saying it's not case enough, and them siding with the régie. So like, if you're experiencing active discrimination and you think, I've got it in writing, I think I've got a really strong case, you have to jump through all these loopholes. It takes all this time, all this money, and to recognize that usually the régie will still side with the landlord. People are not going to go through with that.
No.
And so it's again, it comes back to the idea that this system has been put in place, and we do need to enact kind of a systemic overhaul to really address some of those and really change the way that it works, because the way it's been set up now, it's clearly not working in the favor of those who actually need it.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here and for your questions today, and to the panelists for your insights. Before you go, we'd very much appreciate everyone's feedback on today's webinar. So I'm putting in a link to the chat, which is to an evaluation form. And with the time that we have left today, I'd like to invite you to click on the link right now and fill it out. Evaluation forms are very helpful for us to know how we did, how we can improve, and they can also help you take stock of your own thoughts about today's webinar. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. Happy snow day.
Happy snow day.